Everyone, and welcome to part 2 of our lecture on Chapter 3, Researching and Writing the Literature Review. In the first part of our lecture on Chapter 3, we talked about the different ways that you can begin doing a literature review, starting with annotated bibliographies, guiding tables, conceptual graphs, and any ways that you can organize the literature that you're going to be reviewing for a literature review in a way that makes sense for you. Because again, remembering that the purpose of the literature review is to provide a solid base for what research is already out there on your topic of interest and really argue and defend your position that your research article should be conducted and why. So, in the second part of our lecture, I want to expand further on that by going into more detail on the ways that we critically think and how this literature review sort of leads up to any hypotheses or research questions that we have about our study. So, to start, let's talk about thinking critically. Because thinking critically is more than just thinking about information and just having it in our brains. Thinking critically is all about taking information that we have read or that we have heard and transforming it, inferring about it, making conclusions about it, and looking at the ways that we can change it. And one of the leading ways that we can start to think critically is by reading critically. Because as you're going to notice when you're going through a literature review, you are going to be reading quite a bit of information, and not all of it is important. And if you go through reading articles passively, just reading the words as they are but not retaining anything, you're going to create more work for yourself in a literature review. So if you can read critically, you can streamline the process. And in order for you to read critically, it involves you actively reading. So looking at information and reading the information on the page while simultaneously considering the information that's being given and coming up with additional ideas. And all of that together is going to lead to critical thinking. If you are reading information and thinking about it in the context of your own research interests, not only of how those researchers did their own research, but critically evaluating what could they have done differently, how does this relate to my topic of interest, that's going to be one of the first steps to reading critically, which will then provide you with an option for critical thinking. And it's really important to read previous research critically because our research studies are very rarely completely novel topics. A lot of times, our research is sort of an offshoot or a subset of a previous research topic. And again, I know the images in our book are kind of cheesy, but they make a lot of sense. If you think about all of our research base, the entire body of literature on a specific topic, as a set of flowers, our research is a contribution to that literature in that we've probably taken a bud out of our flower bed and we've transported it into our own flower bed and we're growing it. And it's similar in that it's the same flower, it's the same type of research, but it's going to be different because it's in a different environment. Maybe we're going to nurture it a little bit differently, give it different fertilizer, or we're going to give it different sunlight amounts. And that's the same thing with literature. With our research topics specifically, we can have an entire basis of research on cannabis or alcohol use or whatever your topic of interest is, and your research may be similar in some ways to that body of literature, but it's also going to be a little bit different in some ways because your research has built out of those other topics. And that's how literature works in our modern day of having access to so many research articles at the same time. When you're thinking about articles very critically, you also have to make sure that you're going in and you're analyzing the studies that you're looking at. So our book is going to provide you with a little bit of an example of how to read through a research article by saying that you want to start with looking at the researcher's intentions, their concepts, their theories, and what perspectives they're coming into on their research study. And this is going to be in the literature review primarily for any research article that you're reading. And I do agree with our book that this information is important for us to evaluate because all of us as researchers come into research with our own mindset, with our own biases, and we really have to examine what those are in ourselves and what they are in other researchers so that we can see the research through the lens through which those people also view research. In the same way for ourselves, we need to understand our own intentions, look at any other ideas that are being offered, and we need to critically evaluate any methodologies used by a research team. So look at maybe this particular team did online research. So they were presenting their research in Reddit chat. Oh my goodness, what's the term for it? But Reddit pages. They're posting their research there. But instead, you want to look at research in the field. You want to go out and ask people to fill out a survey on a tablet that you're handing to them. Whatever it looks like, you want to evaluate the methodologies used in different studies so that you can make informed decisions about your own study when you are fostering and critically thinking about how you want to develop your own study. So once you've thought critically about your research, you write up your literature review. And again, the first half of your literature review is going to be a recount and a synthesis and integration of all previous literature on the topic of interest that you are studying. The second half of your literature review is going to be defending the institution or the implementation of your own research study. And at the end of your literature review, you are going to include any research questions or hypotheses that you have made in your own research topic. So this is most often going to be any unanswered questions in the previous literature or body of literature on your topic that you still feel is worth investigating. You'll use a hypothesis specifically if there is still more information to investigate, a specific question that you are trying to answer. You're going to use a research question if you are a little bit more broad and you're looking for the understanding of a possible answer. So there's no specific answer that you're looking to, but rather more of an exploration of what you're looking for. Keep in mind that if you are doing a quantitative study, they can use both hypotheses and research questions, where qualitative studies only use research questions. And then a mixed methods study design will use both hypotheses and research questions. So keep in mind that however you conclude your literature review is going to vary depending on the type of research that you want to do. If you're having questions about what type of research you want to do or what even hypothesis or research question you want to pose, feel free to reach out to me. Email me, come to the optional synchronous meeting. I'm more than happy to facilitate any exploration of research that would be helpful for you in this course. So know that I'm a resource and I'm happy if you can use me in that way. Another thing that you might run into while you're doing research is what we call a systematic review of literature. And a systematic review of literature is different from a literature review. Specifically, a systematic review of literature is a form of a scientific study that brings together every study on a specific topic and draws conclusions from the summation of all of those articles. So a systematic review of literature is really the collection of all articles on a specific topic by specific standards that you then are able to draw conclusions about what information is out there on a specific topic. And this is different from a literature review. So if you remember, a literature review is a synthesis and integration of the current body of research through the framework of supporting our own research study. A systematic review, on the other hand, is a way for us to draw conclusions about an entire classification of articles on a topic, and the research itself is looking at each of those articles and what they can contribute to one another. Where a literature review, the purpose is to set us up for our own research study. So when you're talking about a systematic review of literature, there different from literature reviews in a few other ways. Mainly, the oh my goodness, sorry. There are four specific factors that will differentiate systematic and literature reviews. One of those is that the focus is different, and that's what I was just talking about. When you're doing a literature review, a narrative literature review, the focus is on setting up your own proposed research topic. If you are doing a systematic literature or systematic review of literature, the focus is on drawing conclusions about an entire topic. Also, there's a difference in selection bias. Typically, when you are doing a literature review, a traditional narrative literature review, you have some sense of bias in the articles that you select to review in your own paper. Most likely, you are going to be looking primarily for articles that support the conduction of your own research article. You are probably not going to be looking at articles that say there's no point in me doing my research study. But in a systematic review, you are selecting all articles. These are any article on the topic, and there are specific criteria for inclusion and exclusion of articles, but the selection bias is completely reduced. Not completely, but it is tremendously reduced in a systematic review. Also, the steps and procedures that are used in a systematic review of literature are different than in a narrative literature review. Namely, in a narrative literature review, the steps and procedures are specific to your method section and looking at what specific steps and the procedures that will be done to implement your study. In a systematic review, the steps and procedures are actually defined by how the research team finds their research articles, what specific databases they looked at, what specific inclusion criteria they included, what exclusion criteria they included, what the total number of articles that they found, how they were conducted. Were they qualitative? Were they quantitative? Were the research teams in different countries? That is the steps and procedures. Whereas in our narrative literature review, the steps and procedures are, here's exactly how I'm going to collect my data. And then also, there's a difference in the study assessment and analyses. In a traditional narrative literature review, your assessment and your analyses are going to be reported in your results section and saying, here were the specific findings that we have with numbers. In a systematic review, a lot of times the analysis is the conclusions that can be drawn based on the articles that were found. So you can see there are quite a few different ways that systematic and narrative literature reviews are different from one another. So again, I just have on here a few more definitions to keep in mind. Selection bias being that when you're looking at articles, you may overlook articles that oppose your views and only pull those that are aligned with yours. And we do selection bias a lot more in narrative reviews, whereas in systematic reviews, selection bias is reduced. The methodology relates specifically to how the data are collected. And I think it's really important as well to point out that a systematic review is actually different from a meta-analysis. So a systematic review is looking at the type of articles that are all on a specific topic and drawing conclusions about them. A meta-analysis is almost like a sub-form of a systematic literature review, where you are statistically recalculating the data from an original study based on some standard criteria. So in a systematic review of literature, you're never manipulating the findings. You're never changing them to make them make sense in combination with one another, but rather you're being able to draw conclusions once they are all summarized together. In a meta-analysis, you are taking the findings and you're transposing them into a different form of sort of criteria so that all studies can be compared evenly across the board. So if you have one study that, and a lot of this isn't going to make a lot of sense right now, and that's okay, but if you have one study that reports findings as T-scores, and you have one study that is reporting them as standard scores, and you have another study that is saying that these are ANOVA scores, you can't meaningfully compare them to one another because it's like saying one of them has apples, one of them has oranges, and one of them has bananas. But in a meta-analysis, the researchers are going to take those apples, bananas, and oranges and all convert them to the same fruit salad so that they can all be compared to one another meaningfully. So, this is where we are going to wrap up our specific discussion of the literature review because this leads into the second writing assignment that you will have in this class, which is to write chapter 2 of your research prospectus, which is your literature review section. This particular assignment is due on the Sunday of week 3 at 11:59 p.m. So let's talk a little bit more about what this chapter looks like. Specifically, chapter 2 of your research prospectus is going to be the synthesis of all previous and current research literature on your particular topic of interest. Keep in mind that this is a literature review, so you're not going to be summarizing the specific details of these articles by saying, this research team did this study and they had these participants and they had these findings. You're not going to be doing that. Rather, you're going to be taking the literature that you know on a topic and you're going to analyze the ways in which these studies are similar to one another, are different from one another, and what is missing in this previous body of literature. Because what is missing is likely your proposed study. And there are a bunch of different ways that you can write your own literature review. The funnel technique is a common approach to the literature review that might be helpful. So within the funnel technique, you start broad by introducing your topic of interest very generally, saying, if your topic is, for me, I do a lot of research on suicide. So for me, a lot of my literature review articles start with what the prevalence rate of suicide is in whatever population that I'm investigating at that time. So if it's adolescents, if it's adults, if it's people in Colorado, if it's people in the United States globally, like whatever that means, I usually start pretty broad by saying this is a public health crisis and here's why we know, because this many people will experience suicide at some point in their life. And then, so I'm starting really broad. And then as you go through your literature review, you get more specific. You go into specific details about the topic. So you start to provide definitions of things. Talk about the difference between, for me, again, sticking with suicide, talking about the difference between what suicidal thoughts are and what non-suicidal thoughts are. What suicidal behaviors are and what are non-suicidal behaviors. Providing those definitions and research to support the findings from what I am looking at. And then as you keep going, you're going to relate those specific details to your proposed research topic. So say, well, these previous research studies have found these things, but none of them are investigating the ways that this piece plays in. So if I'm doing a research study that's looking at why people attempt suicide multiple times, I can say we have a lot of research that says that attempting suicide is the best predictor of attempting suicide multiple times. But yet a lot of research doesn't look at the ways that our intersectional identities come into play. So I'm bringing in how this relates to my proposed topic. And then at the very end of your literature review, you're going to include your hypotheses and research questions for your proposed project. So end with, based on these findings, here is what I'm going to do in my proposed project. Couple of other things to keep in mind. It's possible that as you're writing chapter 2 of your research prospectus, you may make changes to chapter 1, which you submitted in week 2. That's okay. It is normal for you to change your research topic as you read more about the current base of literature that's out there on the topic. The one thing that you will want to keep in mind is that before the final research prospectus is submitted during week 8, you want to make sure that you go back and make any changes to chapter 1 so that they are consistent with chapter 2 by the end of the course. But know that it's okay. You're not set in stone for what you submitted on chapter 1. It's going to streamline the process if you're able to stay consistent with what you have in chapter 1. But if you make changes based on the literature that you found and what you read, that's okay. Just make sure you go back and make those changes to chapter 1 before you submit the final project. And then again, as I've already mentioned, the literature review is going to be due on Sunday at 11:59 p.m. during week 3. I highly recommend working on your literature review already now because week 3 is a little bit heavy in terms of chapters because we're going to be covering 3 chapters. So there's going to be more to read and more lectures to watch. So it's going to help if you're able to start this assignment early. So that is going to wrap up our lecture on chapter 3. And that's all that we have for week 2. So I will see you all next week when we go into the next topics.